there are two, as you said, there's a chat session and Q&A session. If one of them doesn't work, please use the other one. And with that, let's get started. We are pleased to welcome James Stevenson with the IFAS, Pinellas County Extension Services, as our November program speaker. He co-authored a beginner's guide to commonly misidentified plants and animals in Florida, which is an ID deck to help users identify invasive and endangered species, as well as venomous ones. James is based in Tarpon Springs, and his specialty is native plants botany. Tonight, he will guide us through an investigation into the fascinating and complex plant kingdom in an introduction to botanical science. And thanks for joining us, Steve. And just you can take it, I guess, from here, and it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share tonight's presentation for you, Botanical Science for Beginners. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to your group. Of course, the Audubon Society is an incredibly important resource for us locally, as well as nationally and internationally, if you want to extend it that far. I am with the University of Florida Institute Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Services. Perhaps you've heard of the Extension Services. A lot of people turn to Extension for advice on how to grow plants, but we have many other specialty areas, among them natural resource conservation. And bringing an awareness to natural resources through various avenues is how we reach the citizens in our county and really just get them to care. Being a botanist, I feel like as soon as people learn to appreciate, recognize the plants that are around them, people might be that much more inclined to protect them. So tonight's presentation, Botanical Science for Beginners, is kind of the evolution of a presentation that we've honed over the years. Originally, it was called Botany 101, and we found that that was absolutely a terrifying title, and no one would sign up, thinking that there was going to be some sort of, heavy exam, or maybe it harkened back to some, failed college course or something like that. So we're just going to approach this topic from a beginner's point of view, just to keep it simple. I am based out of, although I am not broadcasting from, I am based out of Brooker Creek Preserve, and I'm sure all bird lovers are familiar with our largest tract of undeveloped Pinellas County. We are close to 9,000 acres of undeveloped Pinellas County, 50% freshwater wetland and 50% upland, providing perfect natural habitat for those species of birds and all other animals and the plants that are found in those habitats. Our sister preserve is a coastal preserve where the plants and animals that are adapted to more coastal conditions can have free reign. And in our urban county, we know how important these natural areas are. So the Oxford Dictionary of Biology defines what botany is using these potentially terrifying words like anatomy, morphology, physiology, biochemistry. Not the kind of thing you're going to want to tune into on a Monday evening. So kind of rejigged that. For tonight, let's just look at some really cool things about plants. They're all around us. They're not hard to study. They don't fly away. You don't need any special equipment. And perhaps learn some things that you've never really thought about the plant world. Fair enough? Now, with 400,000 known species of plants, this is exclusive of all those crazy hybrids and laboratory creations that humans have come up with, those kind of grocery store orchids aside from all those natural species, we're looking at about 400,000 known species. And of course, new species being discovered yearly, and sadly, certain species going extinct, we hover around 400,000. And we need to break those down. We can break them down by where they're adapted to live. Of course, the rainforest is probably the premier habitat for plant life, kind of mimicking what the majority of the land climate was like when plants were really taking off. But plants have evolved to live in some pretty inhospitable places as well. As long as plants can get a foothold, plants have adapted to living in these conditions. Imagine spending 6 to 9 months out of the year covered in ice. Well, plants can do it. Plants can handle it. There are certain species that are adapted to that. Here in Central Florida, this is a photograph at Brooker Creek of a representation of an upland habitat dominated by oak trees with an understory of, in this case, saw palmetto. So we have various layers of vegetation, each species adapted to exist in that layer. And you'll even notice that there are certain plants that have adapted to living in the branches of the oak trees. In this case, we have Spanish moss, which is not a true moss. It's a flowering plant. It's a relative of the bromeliads. It's a pineapple relative, the Spanish moss. It does not harbor red bugs. There's no correlation between Spanish moss and red bugs. There's an urban legend that have linked those two things together, but it is absolutely false. But the point is, plants find their niche and adapt, and subsequently can define a habitat. So the previous slide showed an oak hammock habitat named for the oaks that are there. This is a pine flatwood habitat defined by the predominant species, in this case, pine trees. We also have hardwood swamps, freshwater hardwood swamps. This is another shot at Brooker Creek, and the plants here are adapted to seasonal inundation. So the plants here are perfectly happy with their roots submerged in water. And just one interesting adaptation that you can notice in the background, these hardwood trees have a condition that is called butt swell. That's actually what it's called. And you can see the base of the trunks here are enlarged, increasing the surface area at the base to afford stability in a saturated, muddy, not too solid substrate. So that gives them that little bit of balance. Our sister preserve Weeden Island is a mangrove swamp. Again, the habitat is named after the predominant vegetation, mangroves and associated plants, and of course the animals that take advantage of all these different habitats. So going back to a bit of a cold and scientific definition of what is a plant, it's any of a kingdom. There are, to some experts, the concept of kingdoms of life. There is the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the fungus kingdom, the bacteria kingdom, the archaea kingdom. So in one of these realms of life, there are these organisms that have characteristics of being plants. They're cellular, eukaryotic, it means they have a nucleus, not important tonight. Photosynthetic, plants make their own food, whereas animals have to eat their environment. Plants create their own food literally out of thin air. Plants generally lack any sort of locomotive capabilities, although we know of some plants, all of us know of some plants that can move in a a time frame that humans can perceive. So, of course, plants move and grow, but that's usually on a very, very slow scale. Certain plants, like the Venus flytrap, for example, they actually have mechanisms where they can move fast enough for us to see. But generally speaking, they don't get up and run around, which as I said, makes them very easy to observe. No nervous system, no real sensory organs, although that's a little simplified, but they have this thing, this one component that is unique to plants, and that is a cellulose cell wall. We'll dive into that in a little bit. The James definition is a living thing made of lots of cells that can do the magic of taking sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and make it into three-dimensional things. Sugar, trunks of trees, literally from thin air. And they have this fantastic and incredibly important carbohydrate cell wall. We're not talking about fungus. As I mentioned before, fungus are not plants. They're not related to plants. They're not even closely related to plants. Fungus belong on the same branch of the tree of life with animals. Fungus is made of the same proteins that animals are made of. And like animals, fungus has to consume their environment. So don't tell your vegetarian friends, but mushrooms are very close to being animals. They're much closer to being animals than they are to being plants. So what we're going to look at, well, what I'm going to give you is a slightly oversimplified, but perfectly true classification system, so that you will be able to look out your window or when you go for a walk. You can look at a plant and you can determine which of the 4 major groups of plants that your specimen belongs to. For our intents and purposes, and for the majority of plants that you're ever going to encounter, they fall into one of 4 groups. So we're going to look at those 4 groups. Then we're going to look and see what they all have in common. What is it about these 4 groups? What did the common ancestor of all plants possess that made that common ancestor the prototypical plant? And we'll finish up with just a cursory look at how plants can perceive and react to environmental stimulus. It's pretty fascinating. Imagine being an organism that is stuck in place, having to deal with all the slings and arrows that the environment is going to throw at you. Plants have evolved some pretty fascinating ways of coping with various environmental stressors, and they do that through hormones, which might be news to you. So we'll talk about the classification of plants first. And it's just what humans do. We classify things. We take an object or an organism, define it, and place it with like organisms or objects in order for us to organize information in our minds. And on the screen, you can see some groups of plants, if you will, classifications of plants, if you will. Trees, an important group of plants. Of course, they're given all the credit for making the oxygen in the atmosphere, even though they don't really. That award goes to the algae, very misunderstood and underappreciated group, but an economically important group as well, the trees. Vegetables, again, economically, nutritionally important group. That's a nice conscription of the plant kingdom, the vegetables. Weeds, again, economically important, worth categorizing. Invasive plants, we don't need to go into why it's important to categorize certain species of plants as being invasive. flowers, the things that we like to decorate our homes with. So these represent some classifications of the 400,000 plants that we know. But these classifications are not scientific. These are subjective groupings. One person's weed, the same species, one person's weed could be another person's vegetable, and one person might revere a plant as a vegetable, whereas it might be considered an invasive plant if it was out of place. So you can see there's a lot of exchange that might go around if we used these subjective categorizations of plants. Scientifically speaking, and reflective of the evolutionary progress through time, plants have kind of settled into four major groups that I think by the end of this hour, you'll be able to remember and then apply when you meet a plant on your walk, on your birding excursion, or wherever you might encounter plants. Those would be the mosses, representing modern species of the very first plants that came onto land, that took that leap from the coddling environment of the sea, where just surrounded by all the nutrition, everything's fine, no need to worry about the bother of gravity, that sort of thing. The mosses had the adaptations that allowed them to come out onto land, dry land, and then basically, literally free real estate for this group of plants to proliferate, speciate, and eventually dominate the land. Moving along in evolutionary time and specialization, the world, ended up with a group of plants that are called the ferns. And certainly that's not an unfamiliar term to you. It's also a scientific grouping of plants that have certain characteristics that place them in a discrete scientific circumscription of the plant kingdom. What makes ferns ferns is this the development of a vascular system, including roots and stems and leaves. These organs are not present in the mosses. Mosses just have the bare minimum of what it takes to perform as a plant on land. The ferns have taken that up a notch with a vascular system allowing them to more efficiently move water and nutrients throughout their bodies. It's allowed them to get much bigger. Bigger yet are the gymnosperms. These plants have serious root systems, serious stems, eventually forming trunks, getting very tall, creating entirely new ecosystems by their development. And they have this fantastic invention, the seed, streamlining the reproductive process, putting an embryo, a fully formed junior plant, in a seed with all the nutrient that that junior plant is going to need to germinate and grow into the next 80-meter tall giant gymnosperm, or conifer, sometimes they're called. The epitome of modern plant evolution and the most successful group of plants with the largest number of species are the flowering plants. The flower isn't really a derivation of the cone. It's kind of a progression in specialization from the cone, where the tips of the branches have these modified structures that form the basic flower structure. And all flowering plants, all the flowers of all the flowering plants are made of the same parts. They're just arranged differently to facilitate different pollination syndromes. And they too utilize this wonderful and efficient invitation. No, that's not the word. Invention, the seed. Again, with a fully formed embryo, fully formed junior plant, ready to germinate and grow into the full-grown adult that will then flower, produce the seeds, and so on. In flowering plants, the most important organ that has developed in that flower is an organ called, and this is not unfamiliar, the ovary, containing egg cells. That ovary, after fertilization of those egg cells, the ovary ripens into a structure that is scientifically referred to as the fruit. Now, put your grocery list aside. Fruit is a botanical term that refers to the ripened ovary of a flowering plant. No matter what it ripens into, it is referred to as a fruit. Not all fruit is edible. I mean, it's all edible once, right? But not necessarily nice. A sand spur. Ever had a sand spur stuck? I'm sure you've had a sand spur stuck to your sock. That's a fruit. Underscoring the point, not all fruit is edible. Botanically speaking, the ripened ovary of a flowering plant is called a fruit. So those are the four. Mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, or conifers, if you will, and flowering plants. The mosses, representing modern species of those very early evolving land plants, they don't have the roots and the stems and the leaves. They do have photosynthetic structures. They do have solar collectors, these little scale-like structures that eventually evolved into leaves in higher groups of plants. They reproduce by spores. Spores are specialized single cells that can germinate, and after a series of cellular divisions and specializations of those cellular divisions, they can become the next generation. It's actually kind of a fascinating process what the mosses do. The mosses, modern species, tend to be found in damp areas without the roots and the vascular system to move water around their bodies. They rely on the humidity, the fog, the rain to deliver water to their surfaces, where they absorb the water that they need to tear apart and reassemble into the carbohydrates that they feed on. So modern species of mosses are most often found in forests like this, nice shady places, protected from too much sunlight, from drying out, and all these things. The spores, being single cells, can find their way over great vast distances. So a moss spore is very likely to land just about anywhere, from the tops of the branches of trees to the cracks in your brick work of your driveway. And wherever the conditions are just right, that will germinate and grow in the next generation of moss. The spores are produced in special little capsules, generally speaking, once a year. The spore capsule will emerge from the tip of a moss plant. When the spores are ready, the little cap opens up and the spores are released into the atmosphere, into the breeze, in order to hopefully land on that suitable surface for them to grow. Here's what spores look like here's what mosses look like undergoing reproduction. They have grown these special stalks with the spore capsule on top. The spore capsule has a little lid that pops off and the spores just escape into the environment. By the hundreds of millions of spores that are produced, it only takes one to land in a suitable habitat, a suitable site for germination, to have a one-to-one successful reproduction of an individual. So it is effective, this reproductive system, obviously, because it's present today as it was, hundreds of millions of years ago, but it's not necessarily that efficient. It's kind of throwing everything out there and hoping that just one works out. What you see in this textbook diagram is that capsule full of spores, an individual little spore. Again, just going to go over this. The spore drifts off and will land, and the cells will begin to divide and grow and specialize. And depending on whether it's a spore that is destined to become a male moss or a female moss, that individual grows, matures, and eventually the female plant on the very tip produces this vase-shaped structure with an egg inside. So the one spore grows into a female plant. That female plant produces this multicellular structure with an egg inside. Meanwhile, another spore has grown up into a male plant and actually produces these capsules that are full of sperm cells that swim, harkening back to plants that evolved in water. That reproductive mechanism is maintained in these land plants, these mosses. And so another reason why these plants need that layer of rainwater or dew or mist or all the other ways that terrestrial systems get water delivered, the sperm then swims through that water and down the neck of this vessel, finding the egg cell, fertilizing the egg cell, and then a separate plant. So our spore grows into the little moss plant that we see. When the egg and the sperm meet, that becomes an embryo, right? It's no different from any animal, with the egg and the sperm uniting and forming the embryo that grows into a different plant. It grows out of the female plant, but it forms this stalk and capsule. So a separate plant connected to that female grows, produces the capsule, and releases the spores. So that's an alternation of generation. You've got one plant that produces the egg and sperm. When the egg is fertilized, that embryo grows into a second plant. It's still attached, but it's a different plant. It has twice the number of chromosomes, right? And it produces the spore capsule that releases the spores into the environment. That's what's going on with the mosses. It takes a specialist to study these things. They're very small. Spanish moss, as mentioned before, is not a moss. It's not a true moss. When the botanists speak of mosses, Spanish moss couldn't be further from their purview. We're talking about this group of land plants, the mosses, the very early diverging plants that have figured out how to be able to live on land, not dry out, covered their bodies in, waterproof coating, able to withstand the perils of UV radiation and so on. Moving up in a little bit of complexity, we have this group of ferns that developed, this group of plants that developed that are called the ferns, with roots, specialized organs, specialized tissues that have particular jobs to do. Whereas our mosses are just, groups of photo collectors and occasionally producing either an egg producing structure or a sperm producing structure. The ferns have streamlined things a bit more, and they have specialized tissues called roots that serve to anchor the plant to the ground, and also the vascular tissue that is meant to get the water and the nutrient out of the ground and up into the organs that are called the leaves, right? But the spore method of reproduction is maintained in the ferns. And you've probably seen the underside of fern leaves exhibiting these spots, these dots. And it's not uncommon for those of us who study plants to be asked by someone, what is this attacking my fern? What are these bugs that are lined up in perfect order on the underside of my fern leaf? This is the fern expressing its reproductive phase. And these dots are not spores. Spores are much smaller than that. It wouldn't be wrong to tell your friend who thinks their plant is being attacked, oh, that's okay, those are just the spores. Well, we're not quite there yet. This is the golden-foot Polypotie, one of our native epiphytic ferns. And the spots, if we were to zoom in on just one of these golden spots, oh, let me just back up a little bit. So ferns express their reproduction on their leaves, their proper leaves. And some ferns look very fern-like and others don't. Here is a adder's tongue fern that doesn't really look very fern-like, but because it has this modified leaf that has the spore-bearing tissues on it, the photosynthetic leaf, the sterile leaf, being more paddle-shaped, it gets to be in the group of ferns. It has the characteristics that it shares in common with the prototypical fern, the common ancestor of all ferns. You might be familiar with bird's nest fern. Another fern that at first glance might not look very ferny if you didn't already know the common name, but if you look on the underside of the leaves, it's got that those rust-colored structures. It's manifesting its reproductive phase. If you grow staghorn ferns, you might not really get that it's a fern if you didn't know the common name again. It's got the sterile fronds, these special sterile fronds that are adapted to cling to the trunk of a tree, and the fertile spore-bearing fronds reach out into the wind. Remember, spores are dispersed on the wind, and so it's got these branching, special, fertile leaves that reach out into the environment to release those spores. But going back to our golden-foot Polypotie, and let's zoom in on one of those spots. There's one spot, that's not a spore. We're going to zoom in and take a look at that one spot. This is what that one spot looks like. That one spot on about, 20 or 30 magnification is a collection of these spherical structures called sporangia. Like gymnasia, it's where the spores hang out. The sporangia, where the gymnasts hang out in the gymnasia, the spores hang out in the sporangia. And you can see various degrees of ripening of these sporangia. There's ones down in the center that are still very pale green. They're undergoing their maturation process. And these towards the top, you can see this little zipper structure that's common. These sporangia are fern specific. You find a sporangia with that zipper on it, you're looking at a fern. This is common across most groups of ferns. So we've taken our golden-foot Polypotie, we've zoomed in on one of those gold spots. This is what it looks like. It's a collection of 10s, 20s of these individual sporangia. Well, let's just look at one sporangia on even higher magnification. Here's that one sporangia. There's the zipper in side view. And inside that are the spores. Remember, they're only one specialized cell. You can't see them. Those special cells are so environmentally resilient. They can survive desiccation. They can survive UV radiation. They can get up. They can be flying alongside you in a commercial airplane. There could be fern spores up there having lost their way, hoping that gravity will eventually bring them back down to Earth and find a place to germinate. And depending on the species, there's usually a finite number of spores produced by each sporangia, generally between either 24 or 36, all crammed into that one little tiny thing. So you're not going to see the spores. Again, it's not wrong to say, I'm looking at the underside of my fern leaf and those are the spores. Well, eventually you're going to get to them, but you're not going to see them. Okay, I think that's probably enough about the Fern Sporangia, because things get really weird after that. Just like with the mosses, things were a little obscure. The ferns have taken it to the next level. Here we have a drawing of that sporangia. When it's ripened, that little zipper pops open and the spores, those single cells, are released into the environment. Those spores, just like our mosses, the spore is going to germinate and grow. The cells are going to divide and specialize, and it becomes a separate plant. Like the mosses, it's a separate plant, but this one we can actually see. It gets to be about the size of your pinky nail, and that plant is referred to as the prothallus. It's a heart-shaped, it's really only 1 or 2 cell layers thick, very diaphanous, and on the same plant producing those structures. Remember the vase-shaped structure that the mosses produced? Here it is again represented in ferns. It's called the archegonium with the egg cell in it. And the sperm-producing structure is the antheridium. And so on the underside of this prothallus, we've got those 2 separate organs, one containing an egg cell, the other containing plenty of mobile sperm cells, again needing that layer of water to facilitate those sperm to swim and find an archegonium and swim down in it and fertilize the egg cell. Once the egg cell is fertilized, that becomes the adult fern plant that we see. So this prothallus is a separate plant producing egg and sperm cells. If the egg cell that's attached to this prothallus gets fertilized, the big grown-up fern grows up out of it. Isn't that nuts? And it's still happening. After all these millions of years, it's still an effective reproductive system. This is an actual prothallus. This is looking down on the top. Those egg and sperm producing tissues are on the underside, where they're much more likely to come into contact with any rainwater or dew or anything else that might be washing past. It is possible to find these. Again, look for places where they aren't likely to dry out. And look around where ferns have become established. Certainly they're producing spores, and the spores are going to be growing. And again, they're very, very small. Maybe you could even fit 2 on your pinky nail, these little diaphanous heart-shaped structures. And here we have the prothallus. Job is done. It had produced the antheridium and the archegonium underneath, the archegonium containing the egg. The egg got fertilized, and here's our little sporling. This is that embryonic fertilized egg, and that's going to continue to grow into the adult fern plant that will then produce spores and start the whole process over again. The mature fern. So you can now recognize a fern. There are certain plants that look fern-like. They might have these leaves that are very lacy and filigree and divided many times. But if you don't find those sporangia, if you don't find those spore-producing structures, and especially if you find something like a fruit or a cone, it can't be a fern. It's not a fern and it can't be a fern. Just because it might have the same growth habit. There are even some plants that are referred to as ferns. Asparagus fern, a terrible invasive plant, not a fern. Flowering plant, produces red berries. The berries get eaten by birds. The birds poop the seeds out over there, and that's its method of invasion. It's not a fern. It's not a true fern. It's a flowering plant. Scientifically speaking, remember, the mosses are a scientific grouping of plants with no vascular system, and they reproduce by spores. The ferns are a nice group that reproduce by spores, but they have the vascular system. Is everyone all right? This is our check-in. Make sure no one's freaking out or wishing they hadn't ever tuned in. I don't think anyone's left us yet. There is a comment or a question in the chat. Oh, yep. Do please enter any questions or comments or complaints into the chat or the Q&A that's also available to you. We're also streaming live on Facebook. Your comments there might take a minute to get answered. The presenter isn't actually tuned into that. But if you are watching us on Facebook, we're glad you're here. Okay, everyone checked in? We're going to continue then with the number 3 group, the Gymnosperms. Now, most of us know these as the conifers, the cone-bearing, the pines, the cypress, the firs, and the hemlocks, and the redwoods, the junipers. You kind of get the conifers, but they're not all cone-bearing plants. Some of them produce fleshy cones, like juniper berries, or cones that are very fleshy. And so, anyway, we refer to them as the Gymnosperms, which means naked seed. So this is the group that has developed this wonderful junior, fully formed plant with a seed to provide it its initial nutrient. There's no alternation of generations. There's no separate thing growing and releasing sperm into the environment and hoping that it finds the archegonium. This has streamlined that whole process and put the embryo right into a seed that can be sent away from the parent plant to germinate and grow and have a little bit better chance at survival than just the kind of lottery of sending billions of spores out and hoping that just one has everything go just right. We all know a cone. This is not the fruit of a pine tree. Remember, fruit does not belong to any other group of plants but the flowering plants. The cone is, however, a reproductive structure, but it is not the fruit of a conifer. Fruit, the word, belongs to the flowering plants. The Gymnosperms worked out secondary thickening, worked out wood, worked out getting huge, worked out making forest, worked out living for hundreds and hundreds of years. Very successful. Their reproduction, however, still mostly reliant on the wind. The biggest organism ever is a plant. Look how big it is. This is, the giant redwood, or the redwood, the Sequoia dendron. Look, it's bigger than a mountain. These plants got it sorted out and dominated for hundreds of thousands of years. But they're not all pine trees. They're not all fir trees. They're not all Christmas trees. This weirdo lives in the desert of Namibia. It's a conifer. It's a gymnosperm. This represents, one of the experiments in the gymnosperm lineage. This one's called Welwitschia. It's a desert plant, as I mentioned, and it has adapted to living in a hot, dry, dusty, sunny environment. It has 2 leaves with a basal meristem. Like if you have hair, your hair is a basal meristem, so it continually grows and gets longer. So these 2 strap-like leaves originate from a meristem that's kind of underneath this barky tissue here, and the leaves just get longer and longer as long as the plant is alive, and they get whipped around by the desert winds and they just break off at the end, but they're continually being renewed. The cones produced when conditions are right, in order to reproduce this incredible species, Welwitschia mirabilis. Cycads are another example of gymnosperm. They're actually conifers. They do produce cones. Sometimes they're called or referred to as palms, but they're not palms. They are gymnosperms. Palms are that final and huge. Palms belong in that huge group, the flowering plants. There really aren't that many conifers left. You could probably study a book of all living conifers wouldn't be that big. They had their time, but when the flowering plants came along, the conifers just couldn't compete as well. They weren't as quick to adapt as the flowering plants. But getting ahead of myself, the cycads are a group of gymnosperms, a group of conifers. You might know our native coon tea belongs to this group, the cycad group. And of course, the very familiar evergreens, and all the derivations and permutations and hybrids and horticultural selections that we're all familiar with as the conifer group. Again, with the male and female. In this group of plants, the gymnosperms, or conifers, producing these reproductive structures called cones, there are male cones, there are female cones, that the male cones produce the male reproductive cells, and the females produce the female reproductive cells, the eggs, harkening back to our mosses and ferns. The male cones are small. They're very brief in their appearance. They have one job. They have to grow, they have to ripen the pollen, they have to release the pollen, and then the tree has no need for those male cones anymore. There's no need to continue to send it any photosynthate, any nutrient, because once all the pollen is released, these structures are basically dead and they fall off. And perhaps you've seen male cones littering the underneath of one of our native pine trees. They're probably the most obvious. These are the male cones that produce the pollen, that contain inside the pollen that sperm. So it doesn't have to swim anymore. It can fly, right? This is a lateral section of one of the scales. You see how the scales have detached? You can see the central axis of this male cone covered in these scales. One of those scales in lateral section, these dark spots are the pollen grains. And you can see, this is my favorite, well, this is not my favorite. This is the best example that I could find on this slide, where you have the Mickey Mouse ears, kind of like that with the ears. Do you see what I'm saying? Those ears are wings, and the Mickey Mouse head part in there, that's where the sperm cell is riding. And it's going to ride on those wings in the breeze. And we all know about pine pollen, again, produced by the bucket load, because the pollen has to find the female cone. We don't have water helping us out anymore. This is all being facilitated by the air. And the pollen is released at a particular time when the female cones are receptive. And so here's a teeny baby female cone. And it takes about 3 years after the pollen lands on the scales of the female cones. It takes about 3 years for that female cone to grow and nourish those naked seeds, equip those naked seeds with a little membrane to help the seed fly away from the mother plant, fly away from that female cone. But this is what the little proto female cones look like, and they're very sticky because they have to grab pollen out of the air, right? So the pollen flies through the air, lands on one of these scales, and again, here's a side lateral section of a female cone, and one scale of the female cone has that very important cell residing on it, the egg cell. So the pollen's going to find its way in between the scales, land, grow. Once it lands, the pollen grain germinates and then grows down this tube and finds the egg cell amongst this mass of cells that support the development of the egg cell, and that membrane that's going to help the seed, the fertilized egg, those helper cells produce the seed tissue to feed the developing embryo inside. And on this female cone, you can see the little membranous wings just sticking out there, ready to be released. And here we have the pine seeds. You might be aware that certain pines are dependent on fire to open the cones. That's not unique to the pines. There are many fire-dependent, fire-adapted plants, of course, but certain pines, their cones have to be burned in order to release the seeds. That ensures that the seeds are going to fall on bare ground. It's beyond the basic reproductive system of the conifers. That's an adaptation by particular species. Most just open their cones, throw their seeds out, the seeds germinate, and here we have a fully formed, we're not alternating generations anymore. When the seed lands, a pine or any other conifer begins to grow out of that seed. How are we doing on time? We're halfway through. Yikes. I'm talking a little bit too much. If anybody needs to hop up and get away, now would be a very good time. We'll take just about a 2-minute break. Do put some questions or comments or complaints in the Q&A or the chat, and I'm going to get a quick drink of water.
So in the chat window, there was one comment. Could you talk a little bit about the cypress needs too, when?
Great, yeah, a perfect thing for our little break. One of our native two of our native conifers, the pond cypress and the bald cypress, those are adapted to living in those seasonally flooded ecosystems or permanently flooded. Some actually, the cypress swamp is a permanently flooded place. The knees are believed to serve at least 2 functions. One of those functions is gaseous exchange with the atmosphere, because in standing water, oxygen is kind of a limiting factor. There's a lot of things competing for oxygen in standing water, and plants' roots need oxygen. I mean, they're all cells. All cells need to respire. All cells need oxygen. The root cells themselves need the oxygen. So sometimes that's a limiting factor. And it's believed that those knees extending into the atmosphere can channel that oxygen down into the roots and provide them that gaseous exchange. Knees, cypress knees could also help with that stability in a saturated soil. So, you're standing in mud, you need to have a pretty wide stance. And it could be that those knees are simply a reinforced surface area to help keep the trees standing. Excellent question. All right, let's crash on after a quick bio break. And we're going to dive into the flowering plants, the biggest group of plants, the most successful, the most diverse, the ones that most of what you're going to see out your window is a flowering plant. The grasses, the palms, even things that you wouldn't imagine as being flowering plants. If it's not a moss or a fern or a conifer, it's a flowering plant. Remember, vascular system, root stems, leaves, produce seeds, that wonderful that successful experiment first exhibited by the conifers, further specialized in the flowering plants, where the flower consisting of 4 different layers, the central organ being the ovary that develops into the fruit. Remember, fruit is, in botanical language, the ripened ovary containing the seeds. No matter what it looks like, no matter what the dispersal mechanism is, a fruit is a ripened ovary. If you ever blew the head off a dandelion, those are little flying ovaries. Those are fruit. The seed is inside that thing. Seed is inside a fruit. But what about strawberries? The seeds are on the outside. No, they're not. But you'll have to take my plant ID class for me to tell you that secret. Flowers facilitate pollination, no longer leaving it to the wind, no longer leaving it to chance. Flowering plants and insects, well, insects predate the flowering plants, and actually there was a brief little tete-a-tete that went along with the conifers and the insects. There were some very early experiments with insects facilitating the pollination of conifers, but it didn't really work out for them, either or. Meanwhile, the flowering plants developed and insects were far more able and willing, and everything just meant more and made more sense for the insects. And with the diversification of flowering plants led to the diversification of insects. The entomologists would say that the diversification of the insects led to the diversification of the flowering plants. See where I'm going with this? But the insects were the first creatures in the air, and the plants took full advantage of that because that's where their flowers were. Suddenly, there's something besides the wind in the air that could facilitate pollination, and everything exploded. The basic flower structure across many groups of flowering plants, they've got this straightforward 5th grade science flower. You got your petals, you got your anthers, and you got your female bits in the middle, the stigma style and the ovary. The pistil is what it's called. And this is perfect to attract a pollinator, welcome that pollinator to land on the surface here, and walk towards the center where the nectar is produced, the reward, and by chance, by design, get covered in the pollen that's produced in the anthers here. And then when the insect wants another nectar reward, it's going to look for the same shape because it knows it can get nectar from there, land, crawl, pollinate, and so it goes. Here we have our little bee flying in to visit the center of the flower where it knows it's going to find some nectar because it's remembered 5 white petals with a yellow fluff in the middle means I'm going to get a nectar reward. I'm going to fly in there and get that. That's very, very basic. That's, like I said, that's the 5th grade biology class flower. And here are those 4 layers I was mentioning. You've got the outer layer, which are modified leaves that enclose the developing flower bud. The next layer are the showy petals that are going to advertise to the pollinators, this is where you're going to get your nectar reward. The next layer in are going to be those structures that are bearing the pollen that it's intending to coat that visitor with. And the center, the most important part, that stigma, style, and ovary containing the eggs, which pollination is going to facilitate the fertilization of the eggs inside the ovary, at which point the ovary begins to ripen with the seeds inside. And that ovary, no matter what it becomes, is going to help get the seeds away from the parent plant. Here we have a more stylized, a more streamlined, a more specialized flower structure belonging to one of our native air plants, one of our native tillandsias, where the petals they don't open wide. They form more like a tubular structure. And the anthers are sticking outside of the whole system. Well, this is perfectly adapted to the face and mouth parts of a hummingbird. The bromeliads evolved with the hummingbirds, and they forewent the diversity of insects and said, I found something else that has now figured out how to fly. These little dinosaurs can visit my flowers, and I'll produce some nectar down in the bottom. As the flowers developed longer and longer tubes, the hummingbirds developed longer and longer beaks, and the anthers dusting those little hummingbirds right on the head with some pollen. Some plants, however, after having experimented with producing showy, expensive flowers, growing petals that don't produce anything at all, they're just, billboards, that's pretty expensive. Some plants chose a more miserly approach and forewent the production of petals, didn't invest anything into the production of nectar, just said, it works for the conifers. Let's go back to being wind pollinated. And we have groups of flowering plants like the oaks that are wind pollinated. And we all know that oaks are wind pollinated. Every spring, the male flowers, and that's all you get with the male flowers, these little ropes of individual little pollen sacs. There's no insect being attracted to this. There's no need for showy petals or nectar or anything. This is just pollen factory male flowers, but they're true flowers because they are those anthers. The female flowers on an oak tree, not something you'd cut and put in a bouquet. They're almost microscopic. They're reduced to that stigma, style, and ovary. The female flowers born on separate branches, stigma, style, ovary, tiny. The wind is going to facilitate that pollination, but once it happens, the ovary is going to grow, right, containing the seed, and we end up with the fruit, botanically speaking, the fruit of the oak tree, the acorn, with the seed inside, the ripened ovary with the seed inside. Perhaps you've grown tomatoes, you get this, you've seen this, you've witnessed this, you've seen the flower bud, the flower open, pollination happen, all the extraneous bits fall off, the petals gone, the anthers gone, their job is done. The ovary, of course, stays connected to the plant, continually being nourished, the seeds developing, the fruit developing, and in the case of the tomato, the distribution mechanism is actually being eaten. So this fruit is a fruit that can be eaten. The seeds survive the journey through whatever eats its digestive system and gets deposited far away from the parent plant. That's only one dispersal mechanism. you can see the parts of the tomato still attached. That outer whorl, the sepals that were the flower bud, those are maintained. Those are retained in the ripening of a tomato. But the stigma and style that lead down to the ovary, those are often still present when that tomato is ripe. You can still see the flower parts. Peanuts are fruit. They are the ripened ovary. Remember, I said it before, all the flowering plants, all the flowers are made of the same parts. They're just different sizes, configurations, depending on the family that they're in. The legumes are a family of plants, and this legume, the peanut, after fertilization, takes its ovary and sticks it underground. It actually grows and forces the ovary after fertilization underground where it's safe, where in the right conditions that ovary wall, which we call the peanut shell, will eventually break down, and those little seeds inside, they can just germinate. They're already planted. They're pre-planted. So those are the four, right? You can do this. You can go outside, and now you can identify at least what major group these plants belong to, and understand that most things are flowering plants. Most of the plants out there are flowering plants, the greatest diversity. So what do these big four have in common? Well, let's go down to the cellular level and look at a plant cell. Plant cells have lots of parts. They are nucleated multicellular organisms. So multicellular nucleated organisms have a lot of cell parts in common, but unique to the plants are this cell wall, the chloroplast, and this central vacuole. These are three things that you're not going to find in other eukaryotic cells. You're not going to find these things in an amoeba. You're not going to find any of these things in your own body cells. These are what are unique to plants. And the cell wall are what give plants their structure. They're what enabled those first land plants, after a bit of experimentation, to support themselves outside of the buoyancy of an aquatic system. And one of the first microscopists, I can't remember his name, looked at cork under one of these early microscopes, and he saw these, square or polygonal structures, and he thought they looked like the rooms that monks lived in, and those rooms that the monks lived in were called cells. And so he said, look, these plants make monk houses. I'll call them cells. And that's how we get the word cell into modern biology. Cellulose is a very large and complex polysaccharide, which means lots of sugars. The sugars that cellulose are made of are glucose. And remember, sugar and carbohydrates are what plants make in the presence of sunlight out of carbon dioxide and water. And this cellulose is waterproof. It is structural. Cellulose has a lot of uses for the plant, but humans have also realized that cellulose can be quite useful for us as well, for taking advantage of the dispersal mechanism of the cotton plant and taking its cellulose and making it into fibers. Paper is made from cellulose, and just look at how the relationship between humans and cellulose has progressed us, arguably, as a species. Being able to record our history and write love notes and so on. The importance of cellulose, this very important plant construct. The central vacuole, again, an adaptation for living making your way outside the buoyancy of an aquatic system. The central vacuole is where water can be stored for use later. It's a little reservoir inside the cell. And when the cells are nice and juicy and happy, everything is called turgid. A plant is turgid. As it uses up that water, and as water becomes a limiting factor in the environment, it's then drawn on out of that central vacuole, and a plant then wilts. So that wilting is the loss of water from that ostensible void inside the plant cell. The chloroplast is where the photosynthesis takes place. And this is kind of cool. I mean, all of this is kind of cool, right? The chloroplast has its own DNA. Chloroplasts have their own DNA, and they have these structures that stack up on each other that contain the chlorophyll. You remember that word? That is the chemical that allows for the exchange of electrons that can rip water apart and rip carbon dioxide apart and put the bits back together and form the carbohydrates, right? Well, it turns out that there's another photosynthetic organism that predates the arrival of plants called bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. And of course, photosynthetic bacteria being living things, have their own DNA. And the bacteria figured out photosynthesis first. And they have all the parts that chloroplasts do. And it turns out that chloroplasts are just captive bacteria. There was a cell way back in the soup that ate a photosynthetic bacteria, and that photosynthetic bacteria didn't die. And the cell that ate it kept it alive. And that little photosynthetic bacteria kept doing its thing and making sugar. And the cell that ate it said, hey, I don't have to work any harder. I've got this live-in photosynthetic character. That experiment became very successful and eventually led to the development of the plants, where these captive photosynthetic bacteria are now part and parcel and almost unchanged inside plant cells. Captive photosynthetic bacteria. There are modern free-living photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria. These are the algae that produce most of the oxygen in the atmosphere. They're the ones that oxygenated the whole planet early on with these photosynthetic bacteria. We go over a lot of this in more depth. Tonight's presentation will be on YouTube on one channel. We have we have a whole catalog of presentations, including what is algae or what are algae, on our Pinellas County Extension YouTube channel. So if you want to bore yourself to death, do turn in there. Back to the chloroplast, that captive photosynthetic bacteria that's common to the plants. I'm not going to go through all these cycles because they scared me to death in high school. They still do. But we know that in the presence of sunlight, plants can take water and carbohydrate, water and carbon dioxide. Look, sunlight and carbon dioxide, plants can do that, take that, and turn it into sugar and oxygen. Magic. That's it in a nutshell. And we have the diversity of plants that are around today. And what we're looking at here, a nice shot of a bunch of different flowering plants. Obviously, the black-eyed Susans being a flowering plant, but that ornamental iris, if you were to see it flower, you would know that it's a flowering plant too. Not a moss, not a fern, not a conifer, it's a flowering plant. So let's finish up with how plants react to their environment. And apologies for keeping you a little late. I do tend to get carried away. How do plants react to their environment? How, if you're stuck to the ground, are you possibly going to defend yourself or adapt to being pushed over or time the production of flowers so that your flowers are produced when your pollinator is going to be most active, or time when you're going to drop your leaves, like the beautiful Japanese maple behind me here. All these things are controlled by hormones. And plants have special cells that produce hormones that can regulate actions in a completely different part of the plant, effective in very, very small concentrations and responsible for many different plant responses to external stimuli. If you've tried to start seeds indoors, inevitably they're going to try and find and expose their solar collectors so that they get the greatest surface area pointing towards the light. These seedlings have grown in that direction. The cells on the side of the plant that is darker have divided into longer and longer cells so that it forces the entire body of the plant into that direction. What regulated that? What told those cells to divide into longer and longer segments? That's the action of hormones responding to the direction that the light is coming from. Here's a little tree seedling whose cliff face fell away from it early in its development. And what was a nice little sapling happily heading up, reacting to gravity, because plants have the ability to sense gravity. This one's gravity got shifted and suddenly it was pointing in the wrong direction, and hormones directed it to then begin to grow the tissues that are trying to right it back up. It's hormones that are doing this. Just the briefest of suggestions of some of the things that hormones can do within the body of a plant. As I mentioned, the leaf drop, the production of certain organs that serve a particular purpose at a particular time of year, like the storage organ that is the potato, that allows that particular group of that particular genus, the potatoes, to survive an unfavorable season as this storage starch underground, so that when the conditions are favorable again and the plant gets the signals and can turn on the hormones, that potato then turns back into a plant, like the one in your salad crisper that you forgot. Just a quick quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica on just opening up your mind a little bit. Just think of the fact that hormones even exist and how powerful they are and how they exist across different groups of living organisms. I mean, it underscores how really, as living things, we're all tied together. We can't ever escape that. And finally, hormones can make things happen that shouldn't. You know, here we have an area of a plant stem that should be producing photoreceptors, it should be producing leaves, but instead, hormones have said, you know, this might be a good place to make some roots. Now, that might be an error. That could be a little glitch in this particular plant's hormone pathway. Perhaps there was some other trigger that fooled whatever cells, whatever of the cells that signal hormones to be produced. But humans have taken advantage of this, and we have been interacting with plants as long as we've been humans, and we've been tricking plants into doing things that they wouldn't normally do for our benefit. And in this case, we can take a plant and chop it up into little bits and stick those little bits into water or soil, and through the action of hormones, the reaction, get those little bits of stem to grow into entirely new plants, basically cloning the plant that it came from. That's a lot of words. That's a lot of time. Again, apologies for keeping you nearly half an hour over, but that's just the introduction to Botanical Science for Beginners. I hope that this inspires you to appreciate our plants a little bit more, open the Pandora's box almost a little bit more on the wonders of the plants that all surround us. I thank you for your attention. There's so much more to learn. Of course, continue tuning in to all the presentations, both live and Zoom for Clearwater Audubon. And if you do, we're not going to launch a poll. Oh, I have to plug our book that was mentioned at the introduction, the very generous introduction. We do have a rapid little this or that guide that my boss and I produced on how to tell very similar species apart. It's called This or That, and it's available from the IFAS bookstore. We don't make any personal money. It doesn't help our bank accounts. It's simply something that we produced that hopefully you will share with others. Any questions, comments, complaints, rebuttals, anything? Any plants you want identified, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. And with that, I will.
Okay. So James, are you working out of IFAS here, or do you have your own?
Yes, we actually, the main IFAS offices are at the Botanic Garden in Largo. That's where you're going to find most of the agents, most of the faculty, the UF faculty that are in charge of their particular program areas are in Largo. But we do have these two outlier offices, one at Wheaton, and there's faculty, the Sea Grant agent, who focuses on climate change and coastal issues, is based out of Wheaton Island. And at Brooker Creek Preserve, we have the outpost, the IFAS outpost there, where the agent Lara Milligan, who focuses on water issues and wildlife issues. She operates out of the office in the north of the county of Brooker Creek.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, it's very interesting. Actually, I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't even know. Let's put it this way. Yeah, and the audience, there are some thank you messages from the audience, as you I could see. Once again, we would like to thank James for his presentation tonight. Very, very informative. And tell your friends and other associates to watch them in YouTube. It's going to be coming up soon. It's going to be loaded up there. So anybody who has missed it will have a chance to catch up. And I also would like to thank each of you for participating in the Audubon activities, and you're getting your the newsletters, I hope. And if you are, I know you are, if you are interested in our field trips, the first one, the next one is Madeline is going to be in Moccasin Lake this weekend, Saturday. And hopefully I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you and ask your friends who are birders to participate in the Clearwater Audubon's Christmas bird count. We started taking names, and the groups are still forming, and hopefully we'll see all of you there. And thanks a lot again, James. Appreciate the presentation. It's a lot of things to chew up there.
It's nice that we recorded it and we can go back and go through it again.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a class. All right. Thanks again. And
thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks again. Wow.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.